Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And it's the 5-year anniversary of this channel. I think it's time to do something special to mark the occasion. So, in 2016 I made a list of my 100 personal favorite electronic albums of all time. That list has since seen a pretty considerable amount of traction, and I'm still pretty happy with it, all things considered. Maybe a couple of placements have changed, but generally speaking, I think I'd have a lot of the same picks for that list if I made it now. That said, that list did leave something to be desired. For one thing, it featured a lot of the same artists over and over. You'll often find artists there who have 2, 3, one with 4, and another with 5 separate entries. And given how it was just a list ranking my personal favorites at the time, it obviously did play heavily into my own biases in electronic music, and leanings towards ambient and downtempo and IDM artists specifically. I still think there's plenty of variety there all the same, but there's a lot more to this genre than that list shows. Point is, of course, I felt like adding an addendum. This is something I've wanted to do for years, and I got a list together of 40 more recommendations for people who want to expand their horizons in this genre, slowly being tweaked over a very long time. I think I first started building it up around mid-late 2017, and then constantly switching out picks and editing it right up until now. And obviously, given how this is the 5-year anniversary of the Wonky Angle, I felt like now was as good as time as any to finally just go through with putting it out there. So, may as well get into the criteria for this list. First of all, this list is not ranked in any particular order. I already did the list of personal favorites. I don't necessarily love every album here to the point of them also I can see them being on that original list. However, I do personally consider every album here great. I'd have to personally at least rate it like a solid 8 or higher for it to make it here. So, you're still gonna see my own biases show through. It's still kind of a personal list, but no list like this can truly be objective. So basically, it's still my opinion, and you can feel free to disagree with any of my picks. I also definitely wasn't avoiding downtempo and IDM, I just tried a little harder to keep it more varied this time. Like, another part of the criteria is that if an artist made my original favorites of all time list, they are not eligible for this one. For instance, I love the Avalanche's Wildflower, but since I Left You was on the original list, so you won't see them here. Not that you need to hear me praise that project for the umpteenth time anyway. Secondly, no more than one album per artist. My recommending several different albums from the same artists in my original list was a common point of criticism for those videos, and I hear ya, better to let more artists get a chance. And it's also worth noting that I did focus this list a lot more on older artists and albums again. I mean, there are some newer picks, but I already got my own year-end lists and the best of the decade list to focus more heavily on that stuff, and there is still some overlap with those. But let's be real, the older stuff is like this channel's bread and butter. Electronic music has been around for decades. There's a lot more great albums out there worth highlighting than just the newest stuff. And of course, this list is not the be-all and end-all, obviously. If you want to know, oh, why isn't X artist on the list, or why band on the list, it's because this video only has 40 spots. Stopped there because that's how many were in the first 2 parts of my original favorites of all time list. But, just saying, not being on the list doesn't make an album or artist not great or not important. I'll probably be able to do another one of these in a few years with 40 more picks. There's so many different artists in electronic music out there worth people's time. But as for right now, I can definitely co-sign all of these projects as essential listening, and let's go with that. So, may as well get into it. This is 40 more greatest electronic albums of all time. First off, we got Tangerine Dream, Exit. Tangerine Dream. We're starting out with one band that some people were quite confused at my omission in the original 2016 list. The legendary synth pioneer band, led by Edgar Froese, absolutely needed a mention on a list like this. Exit isn't exactly the most obvious choice one would go for when it comes to essential listening from this band. I think most people would recommend some of their 70s albums like Phaedra or Stratosphere. There's tons of solid picks to choose from in the Tangerine Dream pantheon, at least so long as you don't go any later than 1986 or so. This band has a very Simpsons-like career arc, just warning you. But Exit is definitely my personal favorite of their albums. the one I've listened to the most and the one that first got me interested in this band to begin with. This is the kind of album that the synthwave artists of today wish they could make. It's not a particularly complex album, it's kind of instrumental synth-pop soundscapes. It's not difficult to figure out that it came from the 80s, but it's certainly not drowning in 80s. It's actually aged pretty damn well, much in the same way as Kraftwerk's The Man Machine. Lots of very nice melodies and grooves with an overtly futuristic flair. Great stuff if you ask me. Give it a shot. Number 2. Cabaret Voltaire, The Conversation. Right, here's one that was properly in consideration for the original Top 100 list, but just barely missed the cut. Like the previous pick, The Conversation isn't the best representation of what makes Cabaret Voltaire interesting, though, to be fair, I don't think any one project of theirs could truly pull that off by itself. This band, who were among the early pioneers of industrial music, went through several different phases with lots of different styles over several decades, and I went with their super straightforward and formulaic ambient techno final album to highlight them. I don't know what to tell you, it's just some excellent ambient techno. And this is coming from someone who knows full well how done to death this style was done at the time. It's nigh impossible to impress me with an album that sounds like this nowadays, but here we are anyway. Double disc epic of some of just the best material this subgenre had to offer, lots of fantastically subtle but still danceable grooves with satisfying melodies and atmosphere, peaking with the impressive 15-minute journey that is Project 80. This band has plenty more interesting material than this that's worth delving into. I'd also highly recommend 2X45, even if it may or may not be more rock than electronic, depending on who you ask. That project is great too, but The Conversation is my personal favorite from them, and the one I'm most frequently in the mood to come back to, so it's the one I highlighted. Number 3. Pete Namlock, Air. Another one that just missed the cut on the 2016 list was gonna be my number 100 pick for a while. Pete Namlock is a tricky artist to recommend since he has like 200 albums with his name on it, and that's not even an exaggeration. He really has over 200 albums. So many collabs and album series and collab album series. But I think everyone out to hear at least one album from the late synthmaster himself, though. He's put out so much good stuff. And Air, I guess, is as good a place to start as any, combining elements of the early pioneering days of synth music with light elements of jazz and with a super well-balanced mix that does wonders to bring the right emotions out of each sound. 9 sections of a cohesive full piece, an hour-long ambient synth odyssey. And while this is probably my favorite Namlock project, it's not by much, if that. The universe he created out of the Fax label has no shortage of great stuff to explore. Number 4. Lucene, Serial Hodgepodge. Lucene is a strange artist who's had lots of different albums over the year that all sound totally different and don't have much of a through line to bring them all together, going through various blends of IDM and techno and ambient and synth pop and other things. And while he could be derivative sometimes, I've also enjoyed basically everything I've actually heard from the guy to some extent, but easily the project of his that stuck with me the most long-term and stood out to me as his best work has to be this one from 2004, Serial Hodgepodge. This album is just freaking gorgeous, combining lots of beautiful ambient sounds and occasional wordless female vocals with strange IDM percussion and glitches that still all come together in a nice, laid-back techno trip-hop kind of way. It's hard to put into words, really, but it's one of those projects where there's really nothing else out there quite like it. Definitely make sure you give it a spin. Number 5. Astral Projection, Dancing Galaxy. Okay, how about some old school no-nonsense Goa-trance? Astral Projection aren't really an outfit I have much to actually say about. This particular kind of trance music doesn't exactly lend itself well to in-depth discussion. The grooves are very simple in their construction and are all kind of built together the same way. But what even really needs to be said about a project like this? I feel like the grooves kind of speak for themselves, rocketing ahead at light speed and constantly propelling themselves forward in a super addicting and compelling way that just sounds freaking awesome. Of their various albums, this was probably my personal favorite. It's at least the one I have the easiest time telling tracks apart from each other. The title track is just such an undeniable banger and the easy standout for me. But there's plenty of other great standouts like Cosmic Ascension, Liquid Sun, Soundform. It's just really solid all around. It may be fairly basic in the big scheme of things, but it just stands out as a particularly great example of the appeal of this specific genre. Sometimes you don't really need more than the basics, so long as you can do them this well. Number 6, from Way Out West, Way Out West. And here's some more trance. Well, maybe closer to progressive house, depending on who you ask. There's also some breakbeat stuff and some ambient stuff. It's a pretty varied listen. But one thing that runs through all of it is how dang refreshing and uplifting it sounds. I think this duo is just really underrated in general. They've put out lots of quality work over the years, and any of their other albums are worth giving a shot. Even if their most recent stuff can lean on the more commercial side, they've always stuck to their identity and never truly lost their edge. Even though this self-titled debut is probably the hardest album of theirs to find nowadays, it's also probably their best, among their best grooves and solidly varied as I mentioned. Really has that old school late 90s refreshing feel to it too, a product of its time for sure, but in a good way. Tracks like Ajar and Dance Held Tornado and especially Domination just kick so much ass and have always stuck with me, alongside the other much more watery and bright and uplifting stuff like The Gift and Blue and all those. It's just a rock solid project, definitely make sure you don't miss it. Number 7, John Hopkins, Immunity. I imagine you probably don't need my recommendation to check out John Hopkins. He's already held up as a modern-day electronic music legend just because of this album. But that hype is absolutely well-deserved, enough so that I felt like it needed to be on a list like this at some point. It's pretty much already cemented itself as one of the all-time greats. Its super unique blend of broken, bouncy techno and IDM-influenced beats with ambient elements and pianos, and the way its 8 tracks almost completely seamlessly link into each other and progress smoothly and constantly keep you invested. There wasn't anything like it in 2013, and there really still isn't to this day. Just a pure one-of-a-kind experience in electronic music. Absolutely beautiful stuff. Number 8, Kenny Shi, Sleeping Madness. Oh man, Kenny Shi now, here's a freaking underrated name. This techno artist from Japan is one of the most unique and well-accomplished artists I've come across. He has plenty of different albums that focus on lots of different sounds with his own core style of playful and light melodies over absolutely banging techno beats with super sleek and well-polished production, the kind of stuff you could easily recognize from a distance. And unquestionably my favorite project of his overall is this one here, Sleeping Madness, which introduced some jazzier elements and worked them into his sound perfectly seamlessly and gave them some real unique texture, not to mention including guest appearances from such random names as DJ Spooky and Talvin Singe and Co-Fusion, and it all comes together in an absolute stunner of a techno record. Absolutely do not miss this. Number 9, Tim Hecker, Harmony in Ultraviolet. Of course, if I'm gonna talk about how much I'm into ambient music, I gotta at least mention Tim Hecker, one of the most creative names in the genre, putting together his blends of instantly recognizable, fuzzed-out drone pieces that have quite a lot of emotion packed into them. He's got several albums I could recommend. Mirages, Rave Death 1972, Virgins, Love Streams, Radio Amore. All great, and all bringing their own different take on his style. But I think this one's gotta be my favorite. I just love how well structured it is, with all these tracks that link into each other and build off their themes so well, and how all these fuzzed out staticky noises can go into an album that still ends up making it feel really huge and expansive and dramatic, yet also calming and comforting at the same time. Ambient masterpiece if you ask me. Number 10, Depeche Mode, Music for the Masses. Alright then, brought on a few picks for this list of the 80s synth pop variety. That stuff is pretty important to the history of electronic music, and perhaps none more obviously so than Depeche Mode. Perhaps different people will point you towards different, more pop-centric albums of theirs like Violator or Speak and Spell, But undoubtedly my favorite album of theirs is this one, mainly because I feel like they got a little more experimental on this one and had more instrumental variety, while still clearly in their peak period. Their iconic style of dark melodies and dramatic synth orchestrations is as easily recognizable as ever. Plenty of tracks that hit hard or just create creepy atmosphere, but not to the point of sacrificing catchiness or accessibility. The kind of project that is very obviously 80s, but just happens to be among the best examples of these dated sounds and why they became popular. Great stuff. Number 11. Goldie. Timeless. So, how about some good old classic drum and bass? I've had a bit of a complicated history with Goldie, to say the least, but I can't deny that his music has had quite a bit of impact on my life. This album, alongside the more experimental Saturn's Return and the more polished and poppy Journeyman albums, make for an excellent trilogy of projects. But I figure I should just go with the iconic Rob Playford-produced debut as the best jumping-on point for those not familiar with him. With plenty of variety from balls-to-the-wall bangers like Saint Angel to more atmospheric cuts like State of Mind and Sea of Tears, or just the incredible 20-minute title track, which is like everything great about this album summed up at once. And while maybe not truly timeless as the title would have you believe, these styles are pretty easily tied to the 90s, they are well done enough that this really doesn't matter and can once again surpass that datedness. If you've missed it before, definitely make sure you give it a shot. Number 12. Paul van Dyk. Reflections. Alright, got some more trance coming up here, this time from one of the most successful and easily recognizable artists in the genre. Now, that may be somewhat suspect given a lot of commercial trance music artists these days have kinda slowly switched over to basically making bland electro-pop music. Paul van Dyk is probably the single biggest name in the genre who's never truly fallen off the deep end. He might have come close in the early 2010s, but even his stuff in that period wasn't nearly as bad or watered down as a lot of his contemporaries. And he's made sure to return to his roots, making straightforward, no-nonsense trance after that. Going through his catalog is a good way to familiarize yourself with the history of trance music and its passing trends and sounds, while getting plenty of solid music along the way that nearly all holds up to some degree. But unquestionably, the guy's masterwork and the project that stuck with me the most, personally, is this album, Reflections. Easily the most sonically varied project in his catalog as well, with some tracks that have vocal features and some instrumentals, some more straightforward trance cuts that either hit hard or create some beautiful atmosphere, and all maintaining that steady beat and adhering to this genre's core ethos while not being afraid to take a risk here and there. Absolutely essential listening here. Number 13. Clark. Body Riddle. Clark is a weird artist to recommend since all of his albums are completely different. I don't know if this isn't even necessarily my favorite from him overall when there's also his self-titled and Death Peak, which made super dramatic and epic straightforward techno out of experimental One-O-Trix Point Never style synth textures, and I've already recommended the latter several times before. He's also got the acoustic leaning and indie folk tinged Iradelphic, the sometimes rough and fuzzed out but other times quiet and nostalgic Clarence Park, or the absolutely crushing banger fest that is Turning Dragon, but I decided to go with his marginally jazzier and funkier outing here as the one to recommend him. Clark still has a clear style he sticks to on this project and pretty much all of his other ones. One that's often very rough and in your face and banging, and his abrasive synths and beats going up against some old-timey samples is done in a pretty dang unique way here. Maybe a little Amon Tobin-y, I guess, but that doesn't quite do it justice either. I don't know how to explain it really, just go check it out and experience it for yourself. Number 14. Manuel Gosting, E2, E4. Sorry for butcher pronunciations. Okay then, now here's a big piece of history that I think people need to make sure they've heard from at least once. Coming from the founder of krautrock outfit Ashra Temple and also Ashra, this project from 1981 is nothing more than a single 58-minute track that is built on the exact same core groove throughout its entire running time, with not much more than various synth and guitar solos on top of it. And while there is technically progression, it's very slow and gradual and not the kind of thing you easily notice. But it's great! I've never had a listen of this thing where I felt like it wore out its welcome. This project also helped form the formulas that would later turn into techno and trance music. Arguably, it may as well be the first ever project to fit squarely in either genre's boundaries. and it really holds up. Maybe an hour of basically the same groove repeating over and over isn't the kind of thing that would be everyone's cup of tea, I suppose, but some people who I'd never expect to be into this kind of thing have mentioned they enjoy listening to it. Like Todd in the Shadows once endorsed it on Twitter, and I did not see that coming out of the mainstream pop music critic. So, I don't know, I mean, if you're not sure you'd be into it, just try it, it might really surprise you. And, speaking of genre-defining classics, number 15, Cybotron, Clear, aka Enter. Alright, now here's another big piece of history I covered fairly recently. This is an electro classic from 1983 from the minds of Rick Davis and Juan Atkins. That's also widely regarded as the beginning of Detroit techno and largely holds up to this day. And you really don't need to know all the backstory or history to get into it. It's just a fun listen. Lots of old retro drum machines and old school synthesizers that are produced really crisply as if they came out today, then futuristic robotic vocoder vocals as well as some kind of subpar but charming regular singing over these electro beats that reminds you this genre might have still had some hip-hop adjacent background. Lots of classic tracks like Clear and Enter and Alias of Your Mind and R9 and Cosmic Cars that all sound totally different from each other but still easily fit together. It may be pretty dated, but it's the best kind of dated, just taking you back to a different time and showing you exactly how these sounds became more commonplace. Definitely give it a shot. Number 16, Gabriel Lamar, Among Trees I Want to Live. Probably the most recently released entrant into this collection. This one's only from 2018, but I felt it so well summarized the appeal and uniqueness of a veteran artist with a decades-long back catalog, though not one that most people have heard of. He is a member of the ambient trance outfit Safi Brothers, who are a marginally more recognizable name, I suppose, but yeah. I've been a fan of his solo work longer. And this project really showcases his unique blend of straightforward blood-pumping techno and more atmospheric and textured downtempo with plenty of offbeat and interesting grooves that can still hit hard. He's had tons of other albums that explore various facets of his sound, from his world beat ambient and dub to straight techno and anything in between, but when this one came out, it really struck me how well it just captures all the sounds he's explored and shows in a concise way why he's an artist worth your time. Definitely worth checking out. Number 17, Stereolab, Dots and Loops. Stereolab is another one of those bands that barely qualifies as electronic. Hell, their first two albums I don't think I would call electronic at all, more like noisy experimental rock. But hey, if Air's 10,000 Hertz Legend, STS-9 Artifact, and LCD Sound System Sound of Silver qualify, then so can these guys. So yeah, pretty underrated and influential 90s group that not enough people talk about these days. I myself only got into them fairly recently, and I'd be lying if I said I loved all of their stuff, but they definitely felt like they were worth mentioning in a list like this. They have a really unique blend of influences from 60s pop and lounge music and krautrock and the old school experimental synth stuff and plenty of other stuff. You really can't mistake them for anyone else. It's hard to put into words, their sound is very much indebted to sounds from 20-30 years before they even got started, but they present these influences in such a unique way that doesn't make it a product of its time. This particular project is highlighted as is probably their most overtly electronic, has obvious influences from the experimental artists of old with its meandering analog synth excursions, but also focuses heavily on vibraphone-driven lounge arrangements with even some old 60s and 70s Lalo Schifrin-style horn sections and parts. Unsurprisingly, right up my alley. Though I'm not even 100% sure if it is my overall favorite. Emperor Tomato Ketchup was about equally as great, had a much more impactful opening, and probably made better use of its length despite not being as direct fan service to my taste. Also really liked Chemical Chords and Sound Dust. Those were really solid too, and the latter might have even been my favorite if it ended 4 tracks earlier than it did. But yeah, whatever the case, if you haven't heard any of their stuff yet, these guys are definitely worth your time. Check them out. Number 18, Erasure. Erasure. Going back to 80s synth pop, well, actually here 90s synth pop from a long-running outfit who broke out in the mid-80s. One of the more easily recognizable names in the genre, well known for their very straightforward style, which lends itself more to short 3-4 minute pop songs that you could easily see popping up on Billboard in the UK. But I decided to highlight them with what has to be their least poppy album. At its core, you still got the same kinds of catchy melodies and impassioned pop vocal hooks delivered by Andy Bell over their typically uplifting and shiny instrumentals. It is still pop music to some degree, but this time these tracks get stretched out much longer. There's time for lots of extended synth passages and solos, and Andy Bell to experiment with his delivery. There's even gospel choirs on 2 tracks, and the whole thing is produced by Thomas Fellman from The Orb. I don't know if this is necessarily the best jumping on point for those not familiar with them. You want a more indicative look of what they're all about, I'd more recommend their 1991 album Chorus, or even 2014's The Violet Flame, which is also excellent. I've probably come back to for more repeat listens than even this one. But the self-titled is probably the one of their projects that leaves me the most impressed and fulfilled. Great stuff either way. Number 19, the Cinematic Orchestra, Motion. Motion may seem like an ordinary jazz album on the surface, albeit a very good one that captures some excellent film noir type vibes, so it may seem kind of out of place on a list recommending electronic albums, but no, it is definitely electronic. The whole project is based on samples. Band leader Jason Swinsko took a bunch of his favorite old soundtrack recordings, chopped them up and rearranged them in DJ Shadow introducing style, and worked with an ensemble of live musicians to make it all fit together so seamlessly it sounds like something that came out 30 years before it actually did. The project may carry the ethos and sound of a different genre entirely, but still is electronic in its approach and background, and the final result is absolutely stunning. The kind of thing that's continually kept me coming in for years. Number 20, Frontline Assembly, Tactical Neural Implant. Industrial and EBM music are admittedly still pretty big blind spots in my electronic music knowledge and tend not to be my thing. But I felt like I should highlight something in these subgenres, and this project, which seems like a pretty common point of entry for people who weren't into this style before, is certainly the kind of thing that I can co-sign the quality of. 80s style synth grooves and drum machines in the Depeche Mode vein that somehow don't feel like a product of their time in any way, but with much harsher palettes of sounds than what those guys usually deliver, with screeching metal effects, bleeping machinery, chopped up samples from movie dialogue, and Bill Leeb's typically growling and edgy delivery, which I do kind of have to be in the right mood to get into, but certainly is a recognizable hallmark of FLA sound that the album wouldn't be complete without. It's a project that very much intends to assault your senses, but is still built on a solid foundation of fairly catchy melodies and punchy, hard-hitting electro-industrial grooves. Even for someone who isn't typically into this kind of stuff, I can still give it my thumbs up. Number 21, Ochre, A Midsummer Nice Dream. Ochre isn't a name that has a lot of historical relevance or was really ahead of his time. I just think this album's a bit of an underrated gem in the IDM world that isn't talked about nearly enough. I think the best way to describe this project would be a cross between Metamatics and Ulrich Schnauz, with strange, broken up IDM beats that still kind of align themselves to a grid and synth tones that are fairly commonplace in this genre, but a fairly different approach to its melodies that are much warmer and more comforting than most other projects in this mold, and done in such a way that does have some darker elements occasionally and allows for some emotional nuance. It's not like the kind of milquetoast pop IDM that only conveys light contentment. It has more to it than that, while still keeping its actual sound design very simplistic and stripped back. Now, admittedly, Ochre's work beyond this album didn't pull me in as much. After this project, he started to include elements of acoustic instrumentation in his blend that felt a bit more cliche to me, and a lot of his stuff afterwards just ran together, or that was my first impression at least. I may have to give him another chance sometime. But whatever, if nothing else, just make sure you check out this album. It has definitely stuck with me. Number 22, Justice, Cross. Another project that you really don't need my recommendation to check out, and I'm guessing most people watching have already heard. It's pretty universally loved and massively popular as is, to the point I could even see some people calling it overrated, but hey, this is a list for what I consider to be all-time greats, and I think Cross is an all-time great. Just absolutely crushing French electro house classic. Their style of completely blown-out sample manipulation and banging beats made a big splash in the mid-late 2000s. and had a mix of both catchy pop hooks and an element of disco funkiness on tracks like New Jack and the ever-iconic DANCE, as well as hyper-aggressive banger moments, many of which just had this all-powerful religious aura around it like Genesis and Let There Be Light, and just the majority of the album in general. The whole thing just had this edge and this rawness to it that really set it apart from the crowd at the time. And while plenty have come around and tried to replicate this project's success in various ways to varying degrees of success, Cross still holds up for me in the same way that it did back when I first heard it. It's pretty great. Number 23, The Art of Noise. Who's afraid of The Art of Noise? The Art of Noise was an 80s producer collective led by Ann Dudley and including former Bugle super producer Trevor Horn, among others. They made strange, artsy electronic music that helped define the overarching sounds and styles popular in this decade. You may see some sounds in common with this project and other Trevor Horn productions like Yes's Owner of a Lonely Heart, with its strange but highly creative sample manipulation and iconic 80s punchiness. Those horn stabs are pretty easily recognizable. But here it's obviously presented in a much more experimental light while still maintaining that tunefulness. There's plenty of weird, artsy bangers all over this project like Beatbox and Close to the Edit, which still hold up as pretty awesome. But the standout moment by far is the 10-minute centerpiece, Moments in Love, a left-field abstract soundscape that has plucking synth voice progressions, orchestral samples, and vibraphones and just seems to take you into a different plane of existence. The project needs to be heard in its entirety to be believed, and while still undoubtedly a product of its time, still totally sounds fresh and striking to this day. Number 24, A Guy Called Gerald, Black Secret Technology. You may know Gerald Simpson as a co-founder of 808 State and the guy behind basically all of their first album, New Build, but after that album he went on to have a successful and very interesting solo career in his own right. I don't feel like A Guy Called Gerald is the kind of artist I can properly do justice by highlighting one album and calling a day. I'm inevitably gonna have to do a full series on him, which might come sooner rather than later. All this guy's albums sound very different, ranging from early acid house to 90s style dance pop to smooth and jazzy drum and bass to hardcore breakbeats to minimal techno and ambient to nearly everything in between. Never settling with one style and often staying ahead of the curve. His various innovations in all sorts of different genres continually hold him up as a true electronic music visionary. And this project in particular is one of his earlier excursions into drum and bass, and the appeal of this one is pretty similar to Goldie's Timeless. Hell, Goldie even co-produces one track on it. But this actually predates Timeless by about 6 months. It's very smooth stuff that can either be atmospheric or bang really hard or both, and has some jazzier tinges with occasional ethereal female vocals, but isn't afraid to get a little more experimental every now and then either. Maybe the kind of thing that you can pretty obviously tell isn't new, but I think it still really holds up. Definitely make sure you look into this guy, either this album or basically any of his others. Number 25, Gas, Pop. Wolfgang Voigt's work as Gas is some of the most interestingly subtle and uniquely executed ambient techno I've ever heard. The way he manipulates orchestral samples so that they melt into mush and placing very faint kick drums underneath all of it is so easily recognizable, and the way he constantly evokes imagery of the forest and presents so much compellingly dark but beautiful atmosphere over all his albums absolutely make him essential listening for any fans of ambient music. Now, his music can certainly be challenging, not the kind of thing that will work for everyone, which is why I've selected this particular album to highlight him. It's by far the least dark-sounding project in the Gas catalog, and instead feels much more bright and uplifting by comparison, despite fitting just as easily in the typical styles that his music always adheres to. Perhaps it could be repetitive and patience-testing, but the overall effect is so immersive and trance-inducing, it certainly uses its minimalism to its advantage. There's really nothing else out there quite like Gas. Number 26, Tricky, Max and Quay. Okay, so I think it's only natural given the kinds of music I typically talk about on this channel that I was eventually gonna have to talk about some old school trip hop. I'm sure lots of people are waiting for me to highlight Portishead's Dummy or Massive Attack's Mezzanine as the eternally loved classics in this genre, And, I do very much enjoy those albums a lot anytime I put them on and feel their massive impact on electronic music as a whole, but honestly, I'm almost never in the mood to actually put those projects on. I've probably listened to Mezzanine maybe twice over the last 7 or 8 years or so, and I'm not sure why it never did more for me. But there was always just this one project from that same scene that stuck with me more than those, and brought me in for much more repeat listens, especially back in high school. And I'm not really sure what it does differently, it just resonated more with me somehow. Might have been I heard this one first, but I don't know. But yeah, Max and Quay is great. The dark and edgy but laid-back beats, Martina's Topley Bird's dejected singing, and Shricky's own low-key, creaky-voiced rapping always struck me, especially the album's opener Overcome, which was the first trip-hop song I ever heard. And the project has plenty of variety from there, with each track having its own unique flavor, going from super edgy rock-influenced stuff like Black Steel, to classic moody excursions like Hell Is Around the Corner, to surprisingly catchy bangers like Brand New Yo Retro, to the pure nightmare fuel that is struggling, yet always sticking to that dark and disturbing mood made out of minimal and very thin but still strongly atmospheric sampling. It's already held up as a trip-hop gold standard, and I think that's well deserved. I'm honestly not sure why it's not brought up even more than it is. Go check it out. Number 27, Jeff Mills, Sequence, a retrospective of Axis Records. Jeff Mills is in the house, yeah. One of the big pioneers of the Detroit techno scene, a founding member of Underground Resistance, and an absolute legend, absolutely belongs on a list like this. Now, it admittedly kind of feels like cheating to include a greatest hits compilation on a list like this, though Jeff Mills is also massively prolific. He has like 30 studio albums and even more EPs, and quite frankly, most of the releases I've heard sounded very, very similar. He's very much the kind of artist who benefits from the existence of a comp like this. And almost none of his albums are available on streaming services. This one is at least on iTunes and Apple Music, so I may as well recommend that. It's also the first project I heard from Jeff Mills in its entirety. But anyway, I thought this comp was a really good showcase of his particular styles of dizzying and disorienting melodies and retro 909 drum machine beats, which range from subtle and sparse to absolutely banging and claustrophobic. A particularly solid introduction to what he has to offer and how versatile an artist he can be. Both great at more laid-back, eerie soundtrack-like ambient techno material, as well as much more hard-hitting industrial beats, with the 2 discs of the comp each focusing more on one of those 2 sides. If you've never dipped your toes into his work, Sequence is as good a place to start as any. Just worth making sure you have at least some Jeff Mills in your life. Number 28, Yellow, You Gotta Say Yes to Another Excess.
I love you.
You know I need it.
This is the most recent addition to the list. I only just recently marathoned the Yellow back catalog and fully caught myself up like less than 2 weeks ago. You'll hear my full thoughts on their stuff when they release their next album, set to come out later this year. But, spoilers, I've been pretty immediately converted into a fan. They didn't have an album in their catalog that I didn't enjoy to some degree, and I'd be open to doing a full series on them someday. I'm almost kind of embarrassed it took me this long to get into them. But in the meantime, if you only know them for the eternally played out sex cue that is Oh Yeah, there's so much more to them than that. Their history goes way back, starting out at the very beginning of the 80s, making experimental synth-pop stuff in the Kraftwerk vein, and continuing to stay up to date as time moved on, moving through lots of different trends at a time, but still sticking to their easily recognizable, quirky style. They're surprisingly ahead of their time and influential, and to best illustrate their appeal, I decided to highlight their 3rd album here from 1983. Probably the album where they first really came into their own and had their sound completely nailed down. Punchy 80s grooves, care of Boris Blank, that sometimes kind of sound predictive of 90s acid house, with lots of samples of random noises, and Dieter Meyer's typically strange vocal passages that can either be singing or spoken word, and just going through several completely different inflections that sound like 5 different people are talking, and with a very wide range of seriousness in the actual tone of the songs. Like, you can have this down-tempo spacey ballad like Lost Again, but then later you get to Great Mission, where Meyer has his voice pitched down and seems to be playing the part of a talking gorilla who burps occasionally. And I don't think that track was even one of the big highlights here. This is a pretty great album all around, and Yellow is a pretty great band in general. Number 29, Primal Scream, Screamadelica. Okay, this was a pretty obvious one. I think this was in consideration for the original list, but I decided against it for some reason that I can't remember. Maybe I didn't want to admit that to this day I still have yet to listen to any other Primal Scream album beyond this one. Maybe it just felt like it wasn't in frequent enough listening rotation beyond the track Loaded. But yeah, whatever the case, this is still an absolute 90s classic. I love it, and I've loved it for years. Combining elements of indie rock, psychedelia, folk, gospel, etc., with the techno and rave styles breaking out at the time, very much an album associated with dropping lots of ecstasy and tripping on LSD. I'm sure this is one of those projects that will inevitably get comments talking about, oh, you absolutely need to be doing tons of drugs to get the full experience. But much like with Nightmares on Wax's Smoker's Delight, I see it more as a replacement to taking those drugs. Listening to this, I imagine, is a fairly accurate portrayal of what it would feel like. The sound design is plenty crazy and wild and imaginative as is, tons of colorful instrumentation flying past you, sometimes beautiful and sometimes disturbing and often both, but still grounding itself in lots of excellent grooves. Major credit for this has to be given to the album's producer, the late Andrew Weatherall, R.I.P. But yeah, this project, like many others on this list, definite product of its time, but also very much timeless. The experience of listening to it is no less potent nearly 30 years later. Number 30, Fluke, Risotto. And speaking of definitively 90s works, here's a seriously underrated gem of big beat and techno from 1997, which never really seems to be talked about anymore. Possibly because the sounds explored here became so commonplace and then dated, or just because the band in question didn't really put out that much of interest beyond this project and burned out pretty quickly after the 90s were over, I don't know. But I remember finding this project back in high school, and I always thought it was really solid. I first heard the track Referendum thanks to a random Pandora recommendation and thought, ooh, this sounds really cool. And then I picked up the whole album, and it turned out to not have any bad tracks on it. The album comes out the gate super strong with two classic fast-paced big beat bangers with iconic whispered vocals and Absurd and Atom Bomb, the former not being a bad description word for the latter. And from there, the album veers into lots of different techno and downtempo and breakbeat territory, and even a bit of drum and bass with lots of hard-hitting spacey grooves that never get stale and have a little bit of a punchy edge to them that's hard to put into words. It's got that specific brand of 90s cool. If you're a fan of bands like The Crystal Method, I see no reason why you wouldn't be able to get into this. Let's make sure it doesn't get completely lost to time. Number 31, Venetian Snares, Rotsichelagolotsulete. Yeah, somebody had to actually try pronouncing that title out loud eventually. Probably messed it up, but I don't care, and I'm sure Venetian Snares doesn't care either. But anyway, Venetian Snares, aka Aaron Funk, is a legend in the world of IDM and breakcore. Few artists out there have abused the amen break like this guy has. And he's made tons of projects of various different flavors that are all super fast-paced and frantic, and not nearly as unlistenable as some of his album titles and covers would have you believe. Well, okay, Winnipeg is a frozen shithole is exactly as listenable as it sounds. But yeah, this guy's generally pretty cool. And I think his best work has to be this project, where he combines his usual super frantic amen break manipulation with classical music. Very upfront string quartets running through every track. And sure, you could say Aphex Twin did it first with tracks like Four and Girl Boy, but Venetian Snares explores those ideas to a much deeper level than RDJ. The orchestral arrangements have a lot more dimensionality and work against the acid and breakbeat surprisingly really well. It's just a lot of fun all around. I think it's already pretty well held up as a classic in IDM circles, but that hype is well deserved. Number 32, Eiffel 65, Europop.
Too much of heaven can bring you underground.
What, you think I was joking about this one? No. I legit think this album is great. I mean, it's not exactly a smart or a deep album, but it's still one that I enjoy enough to find worth mentioning here. Cheesy and dated in the best possible way. Here we have our very, unique-sounding singer, Jeffrey J., who's using autotune just because he and the band clearly thought it sounded cool just as a vocal effect. Back from the days before autotune was everywhere. The Eurodance beats may be cliched as hell, but they always come to mind as among my favorite outfits ever to use this style. Consistently satisfying and well-balanced in getting you to move your body. And of course all the melodies are great on every single track. These hooks will stick with you for the rest of your life. I even think some of the lyrics on this album are not as zero effort as you would expect. For instance, I always really liked Too Much of Heaven's message about selling out and how people who become super rich so often turn into complete dickheads. And they even made a track about their favorite PlayStation games, called My Console. Hey, you didn't think of it. I mean, I definitely will get it if these guys are not your thing. Jay's voice is, let's say, not for everyone, and I can see why people find him to be deeply annoying, and the music is just pure pop, cheese, and Dance Dance Revolution fodder all the way through. But music doesn't have to be deep or artsy to be great, and I never detected a single speck of cynicism in their music. It really feels like they love what they do, and that rubbed off on me too. I don't care what anyone says, this project still totally holds up in my eyes, and I'm giving it my full-on recommendation. Number 33, Plastic Man, Consumed. I actually first discovered Richie Houghton through someone else's top 100 electronic albums of all time list. There was another one on YouTube that apparently had several different people voting on it and going over it for like a full year or even more. And I believe every single studio album by Plastic Man out at the time made that list, as well as 2 DJ mixes Houghton did under his own name, with this particular project of his from 1998 being marked as this committee's overall #1 pick, right above freaking 8592, which, holy crap, that's one hell of a cosign. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I do not think Consumed is the best electronic album of all time, nor would I even consider Plastic Man to be one of my favorite artists in general. But he's definitely earned my respect for his place in history as a pioneer in acid techno and minimal techno, among the most minimal of minimal techno I've ever heard. And yeah, I will admit that Consumed is definitely my favorite Plastic Man album. The grooves on this album are ridiculously sparse and have almost nothing to them, but they always consistently have some super compelling dark atmosphere built out of the enveloping, rumbling, and buzzing bass, little percussion taps, and occasional other elements like high-pitched string pads and some repetitive melodic riffs. As the title would imply, it's an album that can very much consume you and have you falling down its eternal black depths that seem to stretch on forever, and has just barely enough substance and progression to make sure you're never bored. This is very much the kind of album that I need to be in the right mood to get into properly, and I think the guy's music in general is very much an acquired taste. But hey, sometimes less is more, and this project did a lot with very little. Number 34, Tipper, The Critical Path. Okay, Tipper is another one of the newest entrants into this list. Not too long ago I reviewed his last album, Jettison Mind Hatch, thanks to getting so many requests to check his stuff out, and he's had quite the interesting and surprisingly high-profile career. A pioneer in the new school breaks scene, and evolving his sound quite a bit over the years into lots of different genres. Once an impressively skilled DJ and breakbeat artist who would always have a playful edge, but also dipping into down-tempo stuff occasionally, and having put out some excessively detail-oriented stuff in his most recent years that's garnered him quite the obsessive fanbase as of late. But I'm here to talk about the album where it all started, his debut, because quite frankly it's the one that most immediately stuck with me. Just right from the first listen, I absolutely loved it and thought it was super creative in the way it combined styles I typically really liked, with lots of female vocal guest features and orchestral arrangements over break beats, very much in the same vein as Hybrid, but combined with some dark and experimental IDM elements and somehow tying it all up really seamlessly in a way that he could call his own. It was cinematic, it was emotional, it was weird and boundary pushing, it was well produced, it just blew me away immediately. And I don't think he was ever really able to top it. Well, his stuff afterwards went into pretty different territory that you can't really compare this to, but still, definitely go pick this one up if you ever get the chance. Number 35, Donna Summer, The Dance Collection. Alright, this is pretty different from my other picks, but how about we talk about some disco? That's really important to the history of electronic music, especially given the fact that a lot of Donna Summer's big hits are produced by the one and only Giorgio Moroder, who you may recognize from that one time Daft Punk did that whole 9-minute tribute track to them that had his voice from an interview about how he helped pave the way for the scene of dance music we know today. Yeah, this guy was damn ahead of his time. And this collection of extended versions of Donna Summer songs I decided to highlight as his best and most important work. Every track on here is produced by Giorgio except for the last one, No More Tears Enough Is Enough with Barbra Streisand. And funnily enough, that track's by far the worst in the bunch. Well, okay, that's mainly because Barbra Streisand sucks, but never mind that. You pick up this comp, and on top of getting the full version of I Feel Love, perhaps the most historically important track here with all its iconic plunking synth progressions, you get tons of gorgeously arranged disco productions with Donna Summer's incredible voice soaring over everyone and showing her impressive range of emotion and delivery. Especially love these versions of Last Dance and the 17-minute suite of MacArthur Park, One of a Kind, and Heaven Knows. Also not on this comp, but worth seeking out separately, are the full versions of Love to Love You Baby and Try Me I Know We Can Make It, which are also awesome and you should listen to. I don't know. I'm always gonna love me some disco, and this is pretty much the best disco I know. Number 36, Klaus Schulze, Moon Dawn. One more 70s synth pioneer on the list. Klaus Schulze was once a member of Asherah Temple and Tangerine Dream, but only for their first album, and then he broke off and did his own thing, becoming a well-respected name in the Berlin school ambient scene in his own right. I will say, of the synth pioneers I've discussed in this video, Schulze's music tends to be of the much more challenging variety. His albums are always extremely drawn out and slow-paced, and often are just of the plain ambient drone variety. Not everyone's cup of tea, and I'll admit I actually have a pretty hard time getting into some of his other projects like Cyborg and Time Wind for just how patience testing they are and how little of substance there is to pay attention to. But occasionally he'd put out a project like Moon Dawn that would just grab me a lot more. Not exactly much faster paced, it's two 25-26 minute tracks that mostly just aimlessly meander. But the sound design gives me so much more to latch onto. You got mixes of synth sequences and pads and solos, organs, choir-like sounds, random squirting synth effects and textures to flesh everything out and give that futuristic vibe, and even Schultz's own acoustic drumming to really drive these pieces into the outer reaches of space. Even if the actual progression and change over time is quite slow, the mix is plenty exciting and propulsive to keep you invested and entranced by everything going on. Pretty awesome. Number 37, Meat Beat Manifesto, Satyricon. Yeah, no way we're gonna forget Meat Beat Manifesto, the long-running experimental industrial jazz ambient whatever else project masterminded by Jack Dangers, and here also including Johnny Stevens. Nearly all of MBM's albums sound different, and they go through a lot of different phases. They have plenty of great albums, from the expansive experimental soundscape double album Subliminal Sandwich, the almost straight jazz project At the Center, the abrasive industrial 99%, the late period cerebral gem that is Impossible Star. But Satyricon is definitely the one I've most frequently returned to. The mix of shuffling 90s breakbeats, catchy, almost hip-hop style hooks with Danger's shouting British voice and lots of present vocal samples from tons of different sources, all coming together under a heavily political concept about how so many people just let advertising and politicians guide everything they think without question, and falling into state-sponsored mind control and oppression. Definitely not still ringing true to this day, and with this world where the government blatantly tries to decide its own truth completely separate from reality, and you can watch people you know just buy into it. But yeah, lots of smart but angry bangers that can still get stuck in your head, and just a lot of fun to listen to all around. Check it out. Number 38, Arca, Zen. I've already recommended this album in that Essential Albums of the Decade video from the beginning of this year, but hey, why not recommend it again? It belongs on a list like this one too. I had already planned to put this project on this list since I first started up, like 2.5 years ago anyways. But yeah, not only do I think Arca has well established herself as one of the most influential producers of this past decade, but her work on this project in particular has just really stuck with me long term. A strange and formless blob of frightening ambient sounds and melodies, screeching out into the ether. These 15 pieces may not have much of any structure, but they really don't need any. The atmosphere they all add up to is plenty compelling and enveloping, and these tracks just all clearly come together as one big unified experience. And the deeply haunting vibe they create is one that's just kept me coming back to years after the fact. Number 39, Bibio, Silver Wilkinson. Watching the wind blow and rain. Alright, Bibio, another one of those artists who sits on the fringe of electronic music. A lot of his stuff is kind of more like dreamy, mildly psychedelic folk music, and this album isn't that strong an exception. But alongside the nostalgic and airy guitar-driven ambient folk-ish pieces that are his typical bread and butter, like Dye the Water Green and Raincoat, or even stuff leaning more on indie rock like A Tout à l'heure, are also more synth-driven arrangements like Business Park and Look at Orion, and some sample-based tracks like You, as well as some stuff that tries a little of all of it, like Mirroring All. It's got quite a lot of sonic variety, and definitely has enough of a focus on electronic sounds to qualify for a list like this. While on first listen I only thought this album was decent, with every listen its warm and nostalgic atmosphere has captivated me more and more, its catchy hooks have continued to stick in my memory, it's very low-key and unpretentious but very comfortable and welcoming, with obviously plenty of sounds and styles on display in its various tracks to keep me continually invested. It's just all around gorgeous and a real emotional grower. Underrated too. And finally, number 40, J Dilla, Donuts. And let's finish this list with a really obvious pick and an all-time classic of instrumental hip-hop. Before you ask, yeah, of course instrumental hip-hop qualifies as electronic. I mean, just looking at this project, it's nothing but pure blatant sample manipulation, and countless artists in more overtly electronic circles have been directly influenced by Dilla's work in some way. It's not even the least electronic pick on this list. And it's kinda weird because when I first heard this project, I did not get it at all. I thought people had way overhyped it given Dilla passed away 3 days after its release. All of these tracks were not only made out of basically one source each, but looping snippets in a really basic way, and each track was super short, feeling like nothing more than a collection of half-formed ideas. But the first thing that got it to click with me was listening to it offline rather than on Spotify with buffering pauses in between every track, and let me tell you, the difference made by removing those gaps was monumental and immediate. It made so much more sense for all these disparate mini tracks to all come together as one piece. And the flow and consistent rhythms of the edits just struck me so much more. It's really hard to articulate what's gotten it to continue sticking with me and keep me coming in over the years and rise to the personal level that it has. Just the simultaneously weird and playful, but harrowing and heartbreaking mood it all creates, how absolutely striking each of these samples are, and how much emotion is put into each one. I don't really know what it is about this project, but it's just kept growing on me to the point where I've been able to just completely and fully buy into the hype. Just thinking about this guy putting this together on a hospital bed knowing full well his days are numbered, and putting out this final message to the world, like, damn, most of us can only hope to go out in the way that Dilla did. And I think that's as good a place as any to leave off this list. So yeah, but of course this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. Thanks for sticking with me for 5 years. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.